Hi, it's Llarold, and the War Within Prepatch is coming soon. Blizzard hasn't officially announced a date yet, but they have recently made a flurry of blue posts, which indicate that the beta is entering its final phase, the prepatch is almost here, and the new expansion is not far behind. I'm going to give a brief roundup of these blue posts and kind of conjecture about when I think the prepatch is going to land, and maybe even give a little bit of a wish list for some class changes. But first, don't forget to like and subscribe. All right, let's start with the first blue post, maybe the most important one here. This very simple post here that says Dragonflight Season 4 ending soon from Kaivax, and the main thesis statement really here is said in the very first sentence. Let it be known that Dragonflight Season 4 will close soon. There are really two things to take away here. One is that when the season ends, all of these sort of seasonal rewards from PvP, titles, that kind of thing, or Dragonflight Season 4 Mythic Plus rankings, trying to get into that top percent, that top 0.1%, that will all be shut down. That'll be locked in. All of that is done, but after Season 4 is ended during the pre-patch, you will still be able to do Mythic Plus, like plus 10s, and get portals if that is something that you want to have for, probably 2 expansions from now when they bring back Dragonflight Mythic Plus dungeons to be done in patch 12.1 or something. That might not be a bad idea if you want to have those portals, or if you just like collecting portals. All right, now let's move on to, I think, the biggest set of changes from the week on the beta, and that would be the class buffs and nerfs and changes that were rolled out about a day or so ago. And here they are. We have some very basic ones to Death Knight, Rune of the Fallen Crusader, Unholy Strength, that which has been a 6% heal whenever it procs for as long as I can possibly remember, is now going to be nerfed down to a 4% heal. I don't really think that's a huge difference. It doesn't really change, Blood DK doesn't suddenly go from being the best tank in the beta to anything other than still the best tank off of the back of this change, but it probably will have some impacts like in PvP, and maybe just a little bit in terms of sustain for DPS DKs. I think the main purpose of this change, as we'll kind of talk about with another change listed here, is health pools for players have dramatically increased going into this coming expansion, and healing throughput relative to those health pools has gone down. The idea here is that there's going to be more sustained healing and less burst healing, and hypothetically speaking, less burst damage. And all of that really tends to just be a big buff for Blood DK across the board. Just like thematically, by doing that, Blood DK gets stronger. And so they're just kind of nerfing this, and basically all of the percentage heals in the game like this, so that they are not suddenly way stronger. But they haven't nerfed Death Strike, so Blood DK is still looking pretty nice. Next up, we have some changes for Frost DK specifically to their Deathbringer hero talent tree, and mainly these are just buffs, but specifically only to Frost, the Exterminate talent, that's the Capstone talent, and Reaper's Mark, just the initial hit, that's the top of the talent tree. Those have been buffed. A couple of other things have been buffed in here, and we can look at this and kind of see. Here I am logged into I Christmas treed this talent tree, don't worry about that. But I logged into my DK on the beta. I am logged in as Frost, and you can see Reaper's Mark does 75k and Exterminate does 192k. Those are just tooltip values, 75 and 195 or 192. And then if I switch over to Blood, Reaper's Mark now does 64k as Blood, again, compared to 75, so it's about, it's quite a bit less damage, and tanks usually have a little bit of an advantage by having all that extra attack power given to them by Mastery, so it does make sense that they would just tune the DPS skills, DPS spec versions of skills to actually do more damage for them. And then if we look at the final tooltip here for Blood, I don't know how much damage that's supposed to be. It says 245. It's absolute gibberish. Clearly some variables wrong in there, but I would assume that this also does less damage for Blood than it does for Frost. And again, I think that's okay. The idea that tanks would do less damage than DPS is not like my favorite, but I get why they want to reinforce those design philosophies. Next for Blood, Infliction of Sorrow in the Sand Lane tree now extends the duration of Virulent Plague for Unholy or Blood Plague for Blood by 3 seconds when Gift of the Sand Lane is active, was just 2. And Infliction of Sorrow is this talent, the one that they have tweaked at this point 100,000 times. They've literally tweaked this talent, just this talent alone, more than they've done changes for multiple tank specs, which is it's something. I really haven't liked this design from the beginning. I think it's kind of fun and interesting, but with the amount of sort of tweaking and then retweaking and then retouching and then retooling and then retuning that they've done to this talent, I almost would rather that they just kill it and just make it like a 5% DPS increase or something. Even though that would be more boring, they would stop fiddling with this and just move on to do other things. I think that would be for the best. All right, now we have some changes for Demon Hunters, and specifically this is just changes to the Eldrazi Reaver hero talent tree. This was a talent tree that looked like it was going to be a really massive damage increase for single target for Vengeance and obviously for Havoc as well. And so they've kind of gone through and done a sort of a systematic nerf to a lot of the bonuses in this tree. Reaver's Mark gave you pretty high uptime on a potentially 30% damage increase in single target. That's now only going to be 24%. Thrill of the Fight was a 30% damage increase that would last for 10 seconds at a time on maybe like a 30-second cooldown. That's pretty high uptime. They've nerfed that down to 20%. And then they've just sort of reworked the like phrasing of the way that Reaver's Mark works, but it's still exactly the same design concept. And then they also finally dropped in their first and thus far only Havoc Demon Hunter change, which is a slight healing decrease from Lesser Soul Fragments, again kind of going back into the same philosophy that fueled that Unholy Strength nerf. Druids receive very little in the way of comprehensive changes. These are just some straight healing increases for Resto, nothing really noteworthy there. With regard to tanks, similarly, Monk has had a nerf to Healing Elixir. This is listed as a general Monk change, but this is only available to Mistweaver, so this is just one of those changes that got miscategorized. It is what it is. There have been some nerfs to Herald of the Sun for Ret and Holy Paladin, specifically to the healing contribution. That has all been reduced, so that's really just going to impact Holy Pally more than Ret. Ret's not really a big time off healer, and that's fine. There's also been some nerfs to Templar for both Ret and Prot, and I think just coming at this from the tank perspective, it does seem like Templar wasn't really that amazing. The main appeal of Templar really is just that it adds a lot of damage for Prot Paladin, and with Lightsmith adding very competitive damage and also providing group support, and then Templar now being nerfed, I think it's looking a lot more like Lightsmith is going to be kind of the go-to, especially if they continue even further on this path at all. Any more nerfs to Templar or any more buffs to Lightsmith, it's really going to just skew Paladin, Prot Paladin, that is, in the Lightsmith direction, which I'm not thrilled about, but at the same time, it does look like I'm probably not going to be maining Paladin in the next expansion's first tier, and so I'm very happy about that. I'm very happy about that. Maybe the biggest change over the last week for Paladins in general is that Crusader Aura is now the only aura granted by this second aura talent available to all Paladins. Previously, this was something that Rets got by default. Now they have to talent into having Crusader Aura, and Retribution Aura is just completely gone. I never really liked the philosophy of Red Aura, just sort of a generic 2% more damage for the raid or so. It wasn't really all that interesting, but it does mean that Ret Pally has a lot less value to add to raids unless they're able to just do absurd amounts of damage. And it does seem like that's probably not going to be the case going forward. You know, it did look like that throughout most of the alpha thus far, and then Blizzard has kind of nerfed Ret Pally's damage several times now to where it's good, but not absolutely egregious, and I think that's for the best, but it does mean that they're probably going to be still very popular in Mythic Plus, where their utility has a lot more of a chance to shine, and a lot less unique and valuable in raids. Now, one other thing I really want to pinpoint with respect to Ret Paladin is this new talent, Holy Flames. So the old talent Consecrated Blade, which would make it so that when you Blade of Justice a target, it will auto-cast Consecration. That has been just made a baseline skill that you learn at like level 11, so that fuels a lot of AoE damage, just very passive, but you know, that is a pretty nice little talent that Ret Pallies do opt into, and that's just been made baseline, which does free up the ability to then take Holy Flames. And the way it works here, as you can read, it says Divine Storm deals 10% increased damage, and when it hits an enemy inflicted with your Expurgation, which is a very basic debuff, it's just when you Blade of Justice stuff, it will be burned by Expurgation. So when you hit an enemy who just normal enemy in combat, you will spread that Expurgation to other targets as well, so you're going to be able to AoE Expurgation just by hitting Divine Storm, which again in AoE you're going to do, and then you also do more damage to any enemies that you have burning from expurgation. So this is just sort of a blanket AoE damage increase, a little bit more Divine Storm damage, spreading that expurgation around to a bunch of different targets, a bit like Arms and Prot Warriors spreading their Rind around with Thunderclap, and then just getting basically 3% more damage on all those targets. I think this is really good. It's going to really emphasize Rep Pally's strength as a burst AoE class, and I like to see that. That is their great strength. That is really the most interesting thing that they can do as a spec, and I think leaning harder into that really is the best avenue for making them good and interesting and competitive, at least in a Mythic Plus context, if not so much in a more single target, sustained damage oriented raid situation. And then that's pretty much it for specs that I really play and know a fair amount about. There have been some small nerfs to some of the percentage defensive bonuses available to Warrior. Stormwall and Pain and Gain have both been proportionally nerfed. Invigorating Fury's also been nerfed for Fury. That's pretty much it. No changes to really much in the way of tanks thus far this week. Certainly I'm hopeful that there are going to be some more changes coming down the pipeline in the final days of the beta, sort of the time between now and the pre-patch landing, but it does look like they've kind of finalized a lot of their designs for tanks at this point. All right, now let's move over to an update that they made on Delves within the same 24-hour period as they put out all of these blue posts. And here we have just what I would consider like a fairly small update, but something that could actually wind up being very impactful for the way that people play Delves, especially as the expansion kind of matures a bit. And right off the bat here we have the announcement that they've increased the XP rewards from Delves during level up as they felt a bit too low. I would definitely agree with that. I would maybe move the words a bit. I thought that they felt very negligible in terms of the amount of XP that we gained while doing Delves. And if I really kind of had a prediction, I would imagine that they're going to lean much harder into Delves as a method for leveling up characters, especially after your first one when you finish the campaign. I think the idea that you could just be basically spam running Delves to level up is probably something that Blizzard is going to really emphasize, prioritize as the expansion matures. I would imagine it's probably not going to be the intended way during the very first, say, like month of the campaign existing. They probably want you to do, or the expansion existing, they probably want you to do a mixture of different activities, not just one thing. But I think as the expansion matures, being able to just spam run Delves, go in there by yourself, delve, all the way up from 70 to 80, that's probably going to be intended and even encouraged. Now, they have acknowledged that they are continuing to review tuning for classes that are struggling in Delves. I'm really happy to see that because as I felt from playing around with Delves, our preview on Delves, I felt that they were really manageable and pretty enjoyable as a tank playing solo. And for tankier DPS like Rep Pally or like DPS Warriors, I thought they were pretty dope. But for flimsier DPS like Windwalker Monk, and like I didn't play a mage, but I would presume then similarly for mages or anything that's like made out of cloth, made out of paper, it's going to feel like a bad time getting in there and just getting half your health bar eliminated with every other auto attack. So being able to kind of make more iteration on that and make it a bit more enjoyable for everyone instead of just the tanky classes, I think is really, really important. They also have a bit in here about bountiful Delves. And the basic idea of bountiful Delves is just simply they're kind of the max level, max reward structure of Delves, and they just want them to be a bit more doable, like a bit more variety in doing bountiful Delves instead of kind of being locked into kind of the same system as Mythic Plus, where you have to go do this one place and you have no choice. Give people a bit more freedom to kind of play around with them. I think that's a great idea. Additionally, Bronzebeard has been tweaked some, so playing around with Bran, they give you the ability to just instantly push him to level 25, max level. He has all of his skills unlocked and you can go with him. And when you do that, he is quite impactful. He's really strong. However, playing around with him at level 1, borderline useless. Really, really weak. He's basically just a glorified auto attacker, like a vanilla minion that you summon from an item, like very useless, a mechanical Grinch. So having that be tweaked a little bit more so that he will do more at lower levels and not require kind of a big, long, brutal slog to get him up to the point where he is useful is good. I definitely appreciate this set of changes. This is something that like looks like a small change. It could actually be pretty substantial for players' experience of playing through delves. And then finally, I think really the one I want to emphasize the most here, one sentence looks like a very small thing, huge deal. Player class cooldowns will now reset after wiping to a boss encounter. This is hugely valuable because if you wipe on a boss and it was close and you had your cooldowns, you now have to sit there for 2 or 3 minutes and wait for those cooldowns to come back up. And that sucks. Everybody hates that. That's not fun at all. And rather than waiting until halfway through the expansion when people have complained about it and hated it, they are getting that feedback now, and they are implementing the change, the fix for it now. And this is great. This is exactly what you want to see. Very happy about this. This is really good. Everybody's going to have a lot better time. Just you wipe, you get right back in there, go get them, champ. You're not waiting around for 2 or 3 minutes for your skills to come back off of cooldown. All right, next, again, in this span of about a day, we have a change to Mythic Plus affixes again, and these are the level 2 bucket of affix changes, and they've made 2 changes here. So previously I was able to test Xal'atath's Bargain Ascendant, and this is the mechanic, I think I still have the footage of it, where a bunch of orbs will be spawned, like a crazy amount of orbs. So it was 20 of them at a time, and it seemed to be on about a 1-minute cooldown, and you have to use AoE crowd control, so things like Ring of Peace, Incapacitating Roar, Leg Sweep, you know what an AoE crowd control is. You would have to use those in order to make those orbs dispel, and if they got their cast off, which I think it was like 6 seconds or so of time where you had that safety net, maybe it was more like 10, to in some way CC those orbs. If you didn't, then they would massively increase the haste of enemies nearby, basically make them auto-attack the tank to death in 1 second. But if you did CC them, then you and your group would get like 1% haste per orb, up to a maximum of 20%, which on a 1-minute cooldown, I think that's pretty decent. If that value doesn't get increased and now it's just 10% haste, maybe that's not as good, but if they just double the amount of haste and then they double it, that could be good. In general, I think this is just a good change. It really was like a visual clutter, an incredible amount of visual clutter, so I'm glad to see that be reduced to be a little bit more usable, like just easier to use. Xal'atath's Bargain Frenzied has been completely removed, and I didn't really like the design of this mechanic nearly as much as the Ascendant one, where there is sort of this call out and then something to react to. When Xal'atath casts Ascendant, she calls out, there's a little bit of an announcement that the orbs are going to spawn, then they start spawning. You deal with them. Cool. Frenzied just made it so that when monsters would fall below 30% health, they would just suddenly get 40% more haste and take 20% more damage. So like at 31% health, monsters are normal. At 29% health, they now do 40% more damage. And, well, to the tank, they're doing 40% more auto attacks, that's for sure. Casting 40% faster as well. So really a lot more dangerous just because you brought them from 31% health down to 29% health, and then also taking 20% more damage. Just kind of a weird design. And it really kind of had more of an outsized impact on execute classes than anyone else. Bit strange. It was also kind of unfair toward Touch of Death, toward Monk in particular, because you don't get any sort of damage value increase by Touch of Deathing, and people will be kind of annoyed that you're Touch of Deathing that character that's in an execute window. Just, not great. So they've removed that entirely and replaced it with this new affix that I very briefly got to test and look at, and I think it's great. It's called Voidbound, and the way it works is, just like with Ascendant, Xal'atath will show up, she will do an announce, I don't remember what she says, but something spooky. She's very clearly a goth girl, or I guess a goth knife. Anyways, she shows up and she says something like evil, and then then a NPC appears, and you have 20 seconds to kill the NPC. And the way the NPC works is it steadily increases the damage of nearby enemies. It starts ramping up, and the enemy that you need to kill can't be CC'd in any way. It has a shield, and it only has 1 health, and it has a really large shield, like millions and millions of damage. So you're able to Touch of Death it because it only has 1 health. You're able to use like a lot of skills that might eat through shields more quickly. Wrecking Throw, things like that can be really valuable for warriors. And just burn through that shield very quickly. And then once you break that shield, you get 20% crit chance for the whole group for the next 20 seconds, which is quite substantial. Again, the spawn rate on this seemed to be about once per minute, maybe every 90 seconds. It could be sort of like a lot of affixes where it has a chance to spawn at 45 and then it's guaranteed to after 90. But either way, I think this is really, really strong for players. 20% crit chance is quite good. Everybody's going to like that a lot. And then I think the mechanic is just really good. You do have to swap to a target and burn the shield down, but you get this huge damage reward for doing so. So I think it just is like really, really fun and enjoyable and should be really helpful for people while working their way through Mythic Plus and getting up to the plus 12 level, at which point, as we kind of talked about in our last coverage about Mythic Plus, all of these are just going to be turned off and just basically turned into the dungeons themselves being more difficult anyway. So I think this is really good, and I don't think they would necessarily even need to nerf it, even though that kind of has historically been the way that they go about a buff like this. It seems quite strong. They'll then nerf it after players have had a chance to play around with it by having the system in place where once you hit Mythic Plus level 12, all of these bonuses get turned off and just get turned into the dungeon is more difficult now. That gives the masochists who love pain and are doing Mythic Plus pushing, that gives them what they want, and it gives the players who just want to get their weekly done what they want, and I think it's good for everybody. All right, and here we have our final blue post of the sort of frenzy of blue posts that all came out at once, healing updates in the War Within, and this is just a very basic blue post where they kind of acknowledge their philosophy in the idea that health pools are increasing relative to Dragonflight values, and this has changed how it feels to heal, and so they're going to reduce the strength of most of the percentage-based healing spells to keep them in line with intended power. You'll note that they're not really doing anything with Death Strike's minimum heal, which doesn't really matter, and they're not really reducing the proportionality of Death Strike, which is okay. It's fine. It's definitely worked for a long time and been really good, and Blood DK definitely seems like they're going to be the beneficiary of all of these changes. And then they are increasing the effectiveness of hybrid healing and single target heals to ensure they remain effective means of defensive power. I will say that playing around with Brewmaster Monk, and I'll just show off this talent here real quickly. This is a talent that has been changed in the War Within. It is this bad boy right here, Vivacious Vivification. Every 10 seconds, your next Vivify becomes instant, and its healing is increased by 20%. This is roughly how it works in Dragonflight. I think that 20% healing bonus wasn't there. But notably, you'll see that the effect also reduces the energy cost of Vivify by 75%. So instead of 30 energy to self-Vivify instantly every 10 seconds, where you would never, that's never worth it. 30 energy is so much. Not worth it at all. Only costing 8 energy, actually pretty good. And I have thrown some of these into myself, like during raid testing or just playing around. I think I might have even done that in some of the very brief Mythic Plus Affix testing. It is a pretty good heal. You know, it's like 20% of your health. I think for one GCD, that's not insane, but if you're just like walking around and you have nothing else to do, you can throw a Vivify into yourself. I think that's pretty good for something that costs, 8 energy is less than you will regen in the GCD where you spent it. And I think, we've seen a handful of changes like this where these sort of single target heals are a lot more valuable, proportionally more valuable. I think maybe the one thing that I would point to and say I'm not so sure about would be Word of Glory for Protection Paladins. I think that their sustained self-healing is maybe a little suspect, a little concerning. And then Kyvax concludes here by saying, we hope with these adjustments that healing doesn't become easier or harder. Okay, we intend to shift some of the challenging moments from overwhelming bursty damage to a more sustained healing profile. I think just by doing that, just by not having to have the 1 second of reaction time to keep people alive and shifting it out into 5 seconds of sustained healing, I think just by doing that, that is easier. It's definitely a lot easier to clap your hands within a 1 second window than a 1/16 of a second window. And so I think just philosophically, this makes it a little easier. But, depends on kind of managing mana and also just how much healing that healers actually have to do. It could wind up being harder if they just make it a massively increased amount of healing. All right, now I want to talk a little bit about the pre-patch event, Radiant Echoes. Now we know from a brief test all the way back in April that the pre-patch event is vaguely going to be similar to a lot of previous pre-patch events, basically every 30 minutes or so. A series of events will pop up in one of several old world zones. I think according to this Wowhead post, it was Dust Wallow Marsh, Searing Gorge, and Dragonblight, which those are quite far away from each other. And very, very different kinds of places, but that's fine. And the way that it works basically is you need to race around the zone and kill dudes and conclude with a big boss kill. You kind of have a series of objectives around the zone, blah, 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 kill a boss at the end. It's a pretty similar setup to the majority of pre-patch events, and there should be plenty of catch-up gear, cosmetics, pets, toys, some familiar faces, remembered Ragnaros here. And then, of course, just a lot of catch-up gear, a bunch of wands, armor, all the usual stuff you would expect, some transmogs, probably some great XP bonuses for leveling alts as well. I know they have had the Pandaria event going on, but it's a pre-patch event. There's no reason not to give players another way to level very quickly. Okay, before I wrap up, I want to just briefly cover a few specs that have kind of been left behind throughout the beta and express essentially just kind of some concerns that I have here. They definitely need a bit of a shot in the arm as we head into the next expansion. I really don't want to see these guys completely falling behind. And these specs would be both specs of Demon Hunter and Bear Druid. So I have in very large point font, but both because I thought it was funny, but also I know some people will watch these videos on their phones, and so I kind of want it to be a little bit more readable than some of these normal websites here. I have just typed up a very brief list of the changes to Havoc Demon Hunter, Vengeance Demon Hunter, and Bear Druid, and so let's just run through them very quickly. Okay, this week we got our first change that was specifically for Havoc Demon Hunter, and it was a very small nerf to their sustained self-healing that was really part of a larger philosophy of changing healing across the board. Vengeance Demon Hunter got this first change here. Illuminated Sigils now only grants an additional charge to Sigil of Flame. It was previously all Sigils, you know, the nerf to Sigils. And it has also reduced Sigil of Flame cooldown by 5 seconds. Really not a huge bonus. Definitely the fact that they didn't even include Elysian Decree in this, I think it was a real mistake. I think that definitely needs to be included in there. Also, you'll note that this is listed as a Demon Hunter change, but it's not. It's Vengeance only. And then there was a second change to Vengeance. Sigil of Misery now disorients target, whatever, for 15 seconds instead of 20. Basically a meaningless change. You know, hypothetically speaking, it means you can't solo CC stuff quite as long, but you're probably going to be breaking that pretty much instantly in most situations anyways. So throughout the beta, I've kind of been making the joke that Vengeance got their rework in Dragonflight. Yeah, they got the War Within rework already, and I had intended this as a joke, but it does seem more and more like it's actually kind of reality. And if we look at Mythic Plus representation in Season 4, which has been a competitive season, people are definitely still playing, you can kind of see that Havoc is really unpopular. You know, it's below middle of the pack in terms of popularity. It's not a terrible spec, but it's definitely not a top tier spec. And I think a lot of that has to do with the fact that Vengeance has been so utterly dominating the popularity numbers. Like over 40% of Vengeance Demon Hunters, or over 40% of tanks in Mythic Plus are Vengeance Demon Hunters. That's so disproportionate to the kind of standard, the expectation of a balance between tanks in Mythic Plus. In Raid, because Raid has really not been such a competitive season, you know, it's the leftovers season. Vengeance, because it's so popular in Mythic Plus, has remained fairly popular in Raid as well. And then in Raid, Havoc Demon Hunter has been quite a bit more popular, in no small part because it is a pretty decent spec. Not the best by any stretch, but pretty decent. And the need for individual utility from different players in the group is not as necessary in Raid, not as critical in Raid as it is in Mythic Plus. With all of that being said, I do think that Vengeance is going to see a pretty significant drop off in representation if this is the extent of what they get. They're going to see significant drops in representation in both Mythic Plus and in Raid. They still actually have pretty decent amounts of crowd control in Mythic Plus by having Sigil of Silence and Sigil of Chains and Sigil of Misery and Chaos Nova and Imprison. I mean, that's a lot of crowd control to have. But for one, there's nothing new about them, and there are a lot of classes that were already pretty strong underlying strength that have been buffed. We're talking about Brewmaster Monk and Blood DK, and Vengeance Demon Hunter is Vengeance Demon Hunter hasn't gotten anything, and it does look a little dire for them right now. They have gotten some nerfs to their new hero talents, and they've gotten some nerfs to kind of their underlying overpowered strength, but that is basically it. So it doesn't look like things are great for them going into the next expansion in Mythic Plus, and they're terrible in Raid. They might be the worst tank. So that's pretty concerning, especially considering the one thing that they really had going for them was the hero talent spec, the Eldrazi Reaver, that has now been nerfed. And then finally we have Guardian Druid, and this is the only change that's been applied to Guardian Druid. This wasn't even listed as a Guardian Druid change. It was listed as a generic Druid change, but just a stamina bonus reduction for Bear Druid. You know, it's not too great for Bear Druids, and I think with them being a spec that is not super high in terms of representation in Mythic Plus, you know, bottom half of the list on Mythic Plus representation, bottom half of the list in Raid representation, bottom 2 for Raid representation. They really need some kind of changes. All they've gotten is hero specs. I find that one of the hero specs is quite uninteresting, Druid of the Claw Druid, and then the other one, the Chosen of Elune, is interesting, but then it synergizes with Lunar Beam, which is still quite underpowered. That really is something that needs to be brought up and made into a competitive capstone talent, because right now it deals less damage than a Moonfire. And all of that kind of coming in at the very last second, making it look like Guardian Druid is just not going to have any changes in a new expansion is pretty concerning. All right, let's wrap things up, and I'm looking at the in-game calendar here to kind of be a nice little visual representation for this. Given the announcement that Season 4 is coming to a close soon, I think it's safe to say that, right now it's July 11th. I think that we're probably no more than 2 weeks away from the pre-patch being released, which, since that would be on a Tuesday, that would be July 23rd. In the past, WoW's pre-patch events have lasted anywhere from 4 to 6 weeks, and since we know that the expansion is coming August 27th, that would be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 weeks. That would be right in the middle there, and we are right now, we are 6.5 weeks away from the expansion release, so I think July 23rd seems like the only date that could possibly work. Blizzard could change it up on us and maybe hold the pre-patch until July 30th, but I think that's the absolute latest that it possibly could be, and I really think all signs point to July 23rd, and I feel pretty confident about that. So, that means it is time to get excited about the War Within. It's coming soon. Alright, that's it. Thanks for watching. Bye.